Hello everyone and welcome to today's video. Today I'm doing an update on the 2025 Virginia gubernatorial election, which is scheduled to take place on November 4th, 2025, the first Tuesday in the month of November. Now I want to check in on this race because this is, at the time I'm recording this, beginning of August 2nd, and I want to just give an update on where things currently stand in this race. Now if you're unfamiliar, Virginia is one of two very key governor's races that are up in the 2025 elections. This, along with the state of New Jersey, are going to be very closely watched, especially now that we're only a few months away from the November election. We're starting to see the coverage of this race start to pick up. Right now, Virginia has an incumbent Republican governor, Glenn Youngkin, though Virginia's constitution stipulates that a governor can only serve for 4 years, they cannot run for a consecutive second term. You can see the governor run again after 4 years of someone else serving as governor, and then you can run again for another 4-year term, but you cannot run for back-to-back terms in Virginia like you can in a lot of other states. So Glenn Youngkin will not be able to run again. However, the Republicans have nominated Glenn Youngkin's lieutenant governor, Winsome Sears, to be the Republican nominee. On the Democratic side, the Democrats have nominated former U.S. Representative Abigail Spanberger to be their Democratic nominee for governor. And this race started out as being one of the most marquee matchups for 2025 and is going to be a very interesting election to watch out. In today's video, I'm hoping to provide more clarity and more information about how Virginia is currently looking at this point in time for the 2025 Virginia election. Now, if you're unfamiliar with how the state of Virginia votes at the electoral level, in 2024, obviously the last election we had, at the presidential level, Virginia was actually pretty competitive, more so than it was back in 2020. Vice President Kamala Harris won the state at the time by 5.8% against Donald Trump. That would be considered a likely Democratic win, using the margins of 15% win being safe, 5 to 15% being likely, and 1 to 5 being lean. Virginia, by about 0.8%, falls into that likely Democratic category. And Virginia being under a 6-point win or so for Kamala Harris was an early indicator in the night that Donald Trump was doing much better than a lot of polls initially expected, and that he was likely going to be in for a very good night on election night. So Virginia ends up going 5.8% for Donald Trump, for Kamala Harris over Donald Trump. And you may be wondering, okay, well, what does this mean compared to how Virginia usually votes? Well, Virginia is an interesting state because in the early 2000s, Virginia was actually a pretty reliably Republican state. It voted for George Bush by 8 points in 2000. It voted for Bush by 8 points in 2004. In 2008, it voted for Barack Obama by 6.3%. Back in 2012, it only voted for Obama versus Mitt Romney by 3.9%. So it was Republican for both Bush terms, Democrat for both Obama's terms. So in 2016 was going to be a big indicator as the state and how it'd be going. And it went more to the Democratic side for Hillary Clinton by 5.3%. And then in 2020, we saw perhaps the biggest shift in the state of Virginia, where it was won by Joe Biden by 10.1% over Donald Trump. It did move back towards the Republicans by about 4 points in 2024, with Kamala Harris winning the state by 5.8%. But the recent trend here has been, since 2004, it's been won by the Democrat for president every single time by varying degrees, but it has been a pretty reliable Democratic state at the presidential level now by at least 3 to 4 or 5 points or more at that level. And a large reason for this is Virginia is a state that's population has expanded a lot over the last 20 years or so. In particular, you may hear this area talked about a lot. Up here in Loudoun County, Prince William County, Fairfax County, Alexandria, and Arlington, Virginia, these are known as the Washington, D.C., Virginia suburbs. This is where a lot of government workers, people who go into D.C. or right outside of D.C. to work for the U.S. government and government departments, a lot of people move in to these three counties, these key suburban areas, and a lot of population growth has been in these areas. And as the more workers have come in to live in these areas, this area is overwhelmingly shifted toward the Democrats. As I mentioned in 2024, Kamala Harris won Loudoun by 16 points, Prince William by 18, and Fairfax by 34.7. All safe Democratic wins, which actually is better than what Joe Biden did against Donald Trump. For Donald Trump in 2020, where Loudoun went by 25, Prince William 27, and Fairfax 42. President Trump actually made very sizable gains in these areas, in large part due to the fact why Virginia was much closer this time around than it was in 2020. However, if you go back to 2000 or 2004, when George Bush won the state of Virginia by about 8 points, you'll see Loudoun County was Republican plus 15. Prince William was Republican plus 8. Fairfax was Republican plus 1.4. Now, 2004, Loudoun was a 12-point Republican win, Prince William 6.4. Fairfax was a 7-point win for John Kerry. Now come 2008, Barack Obama against John McCain. Loudoun is an 8-point win for Obama, 16 points in Prince William, 21-point in Fairfax. 2012, Virginia ends up being more competitive than it was in 2008, though Barack Obama still wins against Mitt Romney. Here, Loudoun's about a 4.5-point win. Prince William's is a 16-point win. Fairfax is a 20-point win. And then in the Trump era, these three counties have just gotten more and more Democratic, peaking in 2020, going back a little bit in 2024, but still being safe, reliable Democratic wins. And I'm showing you all this in talking about the 2025 governor's race in the state of Virginia. Because as we start to talk about this election, if the Republicans, specifically it's going to apply to them, if the Republicans are going to win, they're going to need to do better than President Trump's margins in Loudoun County, Fairfax County, and Prince William County in the 2025 governor's race. But there's also some other factors at play here that make that a lot harder. If you're unfamiliar with Virginia's history, usually it elects a governor that's the opposite party of the current president of the United States. Usually you'll hear it referred to as Virginia's governor election is a referendum on the current presidential party or current president holding the White House. That would mean that if there's a Republican president, typically Virginia would elect a Democratic governor. And like we saw in 2021, where there was a Democratic president, Virginia elected very narrowly a Republican governor. So despite Virginia being more of a likely Democratic state at this point than a toss-up state, certainly it has much more of a Democratic lean, it still voted for a Republican governor in the off-year election in 2021 in a very close margin. So that would give the Democrats a bit of a boost here for 2025. Now, on the polling side of things right now, there has been a good amount of polls done so far leading to it, and pretty much every single poll has shown the Democrat Abigail Spanberger leading over the Republican Winsome Sears. To put this in a little bit more, I would say, graphically pleasing way, another great website, racetothewhitehouse.com, has their own political polling average for Spanberger versus Winsome Sears, and they currently have Spanberger at 48.8% to Sears 39.7%. So that's roughly about a 9-point lead for Abigail Spanberger over Winsome Sears at this current point in time. Now, obviously, there's still a good amount of undecided vote left out there, but we're starting to get to the point where this is becoming one of the biggest lead in their polling average for Spanberger over Sears. And whether that's the election environment going to be very good for the Democrats, whether it's Spanberger is a better candidate than Sears, there's lots of arguments you can make depending on which side of the political aisle you're on or what the argument you want to make is. But it's very clear here that Spanberger is starting out with a pretty decent floor of support, where she's getting around 47 to 48% starting out. Sears has only broken 40% at July 10th for the last time. Before that, you had to go back to January. So Winsome Sears is starting out with a pretty low floor of support. Given that she's the lieutenant governor of the state of Virginia, she would have to have much higher numbers for this race to be really competitive. That's also significant when you talk about how the 2021 governor's race started in the state of Virginia, where if you look at the early polling for this one, you could actually see that it ended up with Glenn Youngkin very narrowly leading in the polls in the final few days. But the start of the governor's race really wasn't that different. Glenn Youngkin was not someone that was well known before the governor's race. He did not have any prior elected office, and he was running against the former governor, Terry McAuliffe. Now, McAuliffe was leading in most of these polls, but he was leading by a pretty narrow margin in a lot of these polls. The first Republican-aligned poll only had McAuliffe up by 2. Trafalgar Group had McAuliffe up 2. Virginia Commonwealth University was about a 3-point race. Roanoke College about an 8-point race in these ones. And as you start to get closer to the election, things start to narrow up. Just to give you an idea, as I mentioned, I'm recording this on August 2nd. The closest poll to that one would be WPA Intelligence, which showed about a 6 or 7-point lead for McAuliffe over Youngkin at this current point in time. However, it showed as we got closer to the election, things really started to narrow up. This also coincided with President Biden's approval rating at the time starting to go down a lot leading into November. And then we see Glenn Youngkin, who is focusing heavily on Virginia in the political campaign and sort of blocking out a lot of national Republicans and President Trump or ex-President Trump at that time. He focused really on Virginia. This is when the polls started to get tighter in the final few weeks of the campaign, where we see Youngkin actually start to win. But you also may notice in these polls so far, McAuliffe was getting 47, 50, 47, 45, 46, 47, 45 in these polls. When you look at how it's going so far in 2025, Spanberger's at 50, 49, 46, 43, 52, 48, 46. You see that in a lot of these polls, Spanberger's already kind of at that 50% level, where the difference is Winsome Sears is a lot lower at 40, 37, 43, 40, 48 in this one poll, but 45 before that. Sears is starting out with a little bit of a lower floor than Glenn Youngkin was at this current part of the campaign. So what this all means, we're going to have to wait and see how it plays out over in November, as we do have some time moving into the next election. But the historical precedent for this race suggests the Democrats should be poised to win this one. And just to show you lastly, last thing I want to go over here is the 2021 election results in the state of Virginia. Glenn Youngkin, the Republican, got 50.6% to Democrat Terry McAuliffe's 48.6%. And again, I want to show you some very key areas of Virginia very briefly. Loudoun County, which, as I mentioned, Donald Trump lost by about 17 points in 2024. Glenn Youngkin only lost it by 11 points. And then we have Prince William, was about a 15-point loss for Youngkin over McAuliffe. Fairfax was about roughly a 30-point loss. These are very good margins for Glenn Youngkin for a Republican to run in the state of Virginia. And if Winsome Sears is going to win this governor's race, she's likely going to have to match these margins in Loudoun, in Prince William, and in Fairfax. And that's going to be very tough to do in an election environment that doesn't really favor the Republicans. Another very key important area for Glenn Youngkin was he won the very close area of Virginia Beach, where Glenn Youngkin won it by about 8 points. He also won neighboring Chesapeake by about 6 points. And then when you look at how the election went for 2024, President Trump lost these areas. Chesapeake was a 4-point Harris win. Virginia Beach was about a 2.6-point Harris win as well. A key conversation for this race that's kind of being talked about is the prospect of how Virginia, as I mentioned earlier in the video, has a lot of voters, especially in Northern Virginia, that work for the U.S. government. A lot of them may have been laid off due to President Trump's budget cuts at the start of his second term. If the people that have been laid off in Virginia, they're likely not going to be very thrilled with President Trump and the Republican Party. Do they come out and vote for the Democrats in large numbers as sort of a rebuke of President Trump doing that? That would also be a very big gain for Abigail Spanberger. Lastly, we just have the 2017 results, where Democrat Ralph Northam defeated Republican Ed Gillespie by about 8.9%. Now, this race ended up being in President Trump's first term, but it ended up playing out how a lot of Democrats are expecting for this one, which ended up being a very strong night for the Democrats, sort of a rebuke of President Trump. Ed Gillespie, who was actually, I believe, a campaign official for Mitt Romney's presidential campaign in 2012, as the election got very close, he started embracing President Trump more and embracing a lot more of the MAGA party norms and party policies heading into the final weeks of the election, hoping to get a lot of Republicans out to vote for him. And it seems it actually sort of backfired for him, where Northam ended up winning by about 8.9%, and Gillespie really hurt some numbers here in Loudoun County, where he lost by 20, Prince William, where he lost by 22, and Fairfax, where he lost by 36 points. Gillespie also losing Virginia Beach by about 5, and Chesapeake by about 8. Whereas Glenn Youngkin was able to run more of a, I would say, traditional Republican and not really embrace MAGA, but not really push MAGA away either. And he was able to do a lot better in these key northern areas and these Virginia Beach, Chesapeake areas. So that could be something very important to watch for. Now, for my prediction for the governor's race right now, again, as I mentioned, Virginia and New Jersey are the two governor's races that are up in 2025. Currently, I have Virginia listed in the likely Democratic category for Abigail Spanberger to defeat Winsome Sears. The main question that everyone's kind of wondering right now is what the margin of victory is going to be. Because Virginia at this point could go anywhere from like a 5-point Democratic win, maybe even up to a 15-point Democratic win, if not more. It's really going to be kind of all over the place right now until we get more polling data out that gets us a more accurate look of this race. The Democrats certainly have the lead and certainly have the advantage in this race. Really not too much of a question about that. The question will be, though, does this end up being more like 2017, where it ends up being a 9-point Democratic win, or does Winsome Sears in her campaign, if they're not able to get things going, do they actually perform even worse than Ed Gillespie did, getting 45% in 2017? Does Spanberger end up getting something like 56, 47%, and then Sears will be getting around 42 to 43%? That's also a possibility as well. So we'll have to wait and see how this develops over the next few months, but I think at very least, the Democrats win it in between 5 and 15 points, and certainly they have the advantage in this Virginia governor's race. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, make sure to stay tuned as I'm going to be posting another video like this one for the governor's race in the state of New Jersey, so make sure to check that out as well. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in a future video.